But what we're looking at is we're looking at quotes, historical quotes, that demonstrate that Jesus was a person of history. This is important because there are skeptics today and those who do not believe the Bible, and that's, kind of what we're addressing here in a class on evidences, who deny that Jesus ever existed. Okay? There was never a person named Jesus. There was never a real person who lived and was named Jesus. All of that is all made up. And so what I have been doing is I have been using some historical sources, not from a Christian background, to demonstrate that, in fact, Jesus did exist. Now, I am going to say this because we did have the discussion that we had. Historical resources are non-inspired historical records. They are not authority for anything that we say, do, or believe as Christians today. They are written by pagans, heathens, most of the time by people who were enemies of Christianity. Okay? People who were not sympathetic to Christianity. Very important that you understand bias. Okay? When I study history, and this might be kind of surprising to some of y'all if you've not studied history, we kind of think that history is a non-biased science, right? It is absolutely not a non-biased science. Okay? When I was at the university, we studied Marxist history. There is such a thing. It's communists who wrote historical books, and they wrote it from their perspective. There's all sorts of different kinds of history. There's feminist history out there, okay? Everybody has a bias. Everybody has a bias. And so when they write history, that comes through in that as well. And so when you deal with historical records, you have to deal with them properly. As a historian, you have to deal with them properly. You have to remember what the background is and what the bias is, okay? When we're using these kinds of records to demonstrate a historical fact concerning evidences, we need to not read too much into the quotes. Remember what the quote is about. It is about demonstrating that Jesus is a person of history and nothing more whatsoever. Okay? It is not about determining what we do, what we believe, or what we practice as Christians. What is the only source for that today for Christians? Bible. Specifically, the New Testament. Okay, so we need to remember that. All right, so our next quote that we're looking at this evening is from a fellow whose name was Josephus. Who was Josephus?
Jewish historian.
He's a Jewish historian living in the latter half of the first century A.D. His name was Flavius Josephus. Actually, it was something else among the Jews before he was adopted a Roman name because of his benefactor. But we know him as Josephus. Okay, he's a Jewish historian. Is he really good? Yes.
For this time story, right? He's really pretty good.
He's really good, even out of his time period. Okay, is he 100% accurate? No. Does he have a bias? Yes. Okay, so Josephus writes about the condemnation of James before the Jewish Sanhedrin, and he refers to James as the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ. Okay? So you've got James, who is on trial before the Jewish Sanhedrin, before the Jewish council. Josephus is writing about this. He identifies James as the brother of Jesus. Okay? Josephus does not question or debate whether Jesus was a real individual. Because he was. Okay? Josephus is coming from the latter half of the first century. So that's what he says. Is Josephus a Christian? No. He never becomes one. Okay? He's actually, a lot of Jewish folks would consider him a traitor because he actually went over to the Roman side during the Jewish revolt. That's how he survived. Okay? Otherwise, he would have died with the others. Okay? But he writes this, and he gives this historical reference. We have another quote from Josephus. This is from his book, Antiquities, book 18, chapters 63 through 64. And this is what you would read if you opened a copy of Josephus today. About this time, there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he wrought surprising feats. He was the Christ. When Pilate condemned him to be crucified, those who had come to love him did not give up their affection for them. On the third day he appeared, restored to life, and the tribe of Christians has not disappeared. All right, the reason that those sections there are in green is because there is a great deal of controversy about whether that's actually something that Josephus wrote. These are in green. These parts here are often believed, not 100% of the time, but often believed to be later additions by Christian scribes. Okay? So Christian scribes are copying Josephus. They're making a new copy to replace the old copy. And as they're going in, some Christian scribe, so the theory goes, at some point in time added these texts. All right? I will tell you that it is very difficult to know whether that is true or not. However, we do have a manuscript of Josephus from the 10th century in Arabic, and these passages are not there. Okay? So I want you to look at this passage without the green. Does it change anything? Take the green out. Does it change anything as to why we are looking at that quote tonight?
No.
It doesn't. Because the reason we're looking at that quote tonight is to demonstrate that Jesus was a person of history. Josephus is writing in the latter half of the first century. That means he is removed from Jesus by about 30 to 40 years. And he says, there was a guy named Jesus that lived. He was a wise man. He wrought surprising feats. He was the Christ. Okay? That doesn't mean that Josephus is a believer in that fact, but that's what he records. Okay? Pilate condemns him to be crucified. Those who had come to love him did not give up their affection for him, so they kept following him, and Christians have not disappeared until the time of his writing this. So from the standpoint of understanding Jesus as a real historical person, it doesn't matter whether we have the green or not. So the fact that a Christian scribe might have added that later doesn't change anything for the purpose of why we're using this. Tom?
Do you know what he wrote? What did he write in Greek, or did he write in?
He wrote in Greek.
Okay.
He wrote in Greek. I do not think that he wrote in Latin. I'm not sure that he would have been able to even read and write Latin, because he's coming from a Jewish area, a Jewish background. His second language would most likely have been Greek. In the Eastern Mediterranean, even the language of the Roman Empire was by and large Greek. Okay? And our copies that our English translations are from are Greek, as far as I know. But it was translated into other languages. It was translated into Arabic by the 10th century. Okay?
The earliest,
So,
you know, the earliest
extent,
copy.
I don't know. Not off the top of my head. I will give you that Arabic version. Okay, this is from the 10th century. Again, it's in a translation into Arabic. And it says, at this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, Christ, okay, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. So the Arabic translation here is a little bit different than our English translations from the Greek. But understanding the nature of manuscripts, that really should not surprise us a whole lot. All right, so let's go on to our next source then, which is, there you got the reference. All right, so our next source is from a man whose name was Lucian of Samosata. That's where he was from. Okay, he is a 2nd century Greek satirist. So he writes what? Satires. Okay, and he wrote one called "The Death of Peregrine." Or Peregrine, I'm not sure how we say that. And this is what he wrote. He said, "The Christians worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. It was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment that they are converted, and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws." All right, Jesus is not mentioned by name here, but we all understand that's who he's talking about, right? And historians would understand that as to who that's talking about. So, Jesus is not named directly, but we have one, that he is worshipped by these folks called Christians. He was crucified. And then we read here that they all count each other as brothers. They do not worship the gods of Greece. They worship this crucified sage, that would be Jesus, and live after his laws. So again, from a historical standpoint, we have references from Romans, we have references from Greeks, we have references from a Jewish historian, all of whom accept Jesus as a real historical person. Okay? Really, really important for us to understand that. So when you read an article in National Geographic or Newsweek or whatever that says, we don't really know that Jesus lived, as a historian, that is absolute nonsense. It is sensationalism made to get you to buy copies of their National Geographic magazine. All right? On the internet, it's called, if it were on the internet, what would it be called?
Clickbait.
Clickbait. Okay? That's an article that everyone's going to click on because they want to read what that's all about. And it's all about clicking on it because then they make money off your clicks. Right? Right. Okay. I've never gone viral on YouTube. Never will go viral on YouTube. But YouTube, for a lot of people, is a money-making enterprise. How many followers they have determine how much they're going to get paid. If you watch on YouTube, all of a sudden you want to click on a video about how to fix your plumbing. And before you get to the video about how to fix your plumbing, there's an ad, right? That ad is making money for the person who made the video and for the company that put the ad out there. Lots of money going on there. It's clickbait. It's made to generate funds. I had a guy, I'm sure he was not for real, that I didn't answer him, let's put it that way, who messaged me and said, I can make you go viral on YouTube. Yeah.
That's scary.
No, we didn't go there. So I just deleted that email, all right? And maybe he could. Okay, there are ways to do that. I mean, when you hear about somebody who's 18 or 19 years old, who, if I say influencer, how many of y'all understand that term? Raise your hand if you understand the term influencer. Okay, what's an influencer?
Influences.
Influences for whatever way because they've got 3 million followers. So on TikTok, somebody reports that you can break into certain makes of models of cars without a key. With only a USB cable. And before you know it, that make and model of car becomes the single most stolen car in America. Because everybody saw it on YouTube, and every 15-year-old out there that wants a joyride is hitting the 2019 Kia with a no push-button start.
And State Farm will insure you. And Geico will insure you.
And if you have a Kia from those years where that happened, Anna's exactly right. Insurance companies are refusing to insure those vehicles because of something that happened on TikTok. Okay? So when you see something like that, National Geographic gets to sell copies of the magazine. Historically speaking, absolutely Jesus lived. Okay? It's absolutely, from a historical standpoint, ridiculous to make the claim that he didn't. All right. So we've established he really lived. Now we got to ask the question: was Jesus raised from the dead? All right. This is lengthy. We're not going to finish this evening. We're going to take our time going through it, but certainly we'll do it this evening, and we'll fully finish it up next class. So we need to understand, we need to remember, first of all, Jesus predicted his own resurrection. The resurrection was not an accident. The resurrection wasn't something that Jesus died on the cross Friday afternoon. Sunday morning he wakes up in the tomb quite surprised to be awake and alive again. No, Jesus predicted his own resurrection. And in fact, we also need to understand and remember that the resurrection of Jesus was a fundamental tenet of the early Christians, as has already been seen in sources that we've looked at outside the New Testament. So even people outside of Christianity, remember all those historical sources, those are not Christians. They're all writing about the fact that these people believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. All right? They don't say he was. They say that's what Christians believed. Okay? So, as we look at the Bible, as we look at the New Testament, we're going to find how important that is. So we've got a series of Bible verses here. Matthew chapter 16, verse 21. From that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. So Matthew, in writing his gospel, what does he say about Jesus? Jesus is telling his disciples what's going to happen. That he is going to go to Jerusalem. That he is going to suffer there. He's going to be killed, but on the third day he's going to be raised. Right? That's Matthew's commentary on that. If we look in Matthew chapter 17, verses 22 and 23, as they were gathering in Galilee, Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men. And they will kill him, and he will be raised on the third day." Okay? So again, Matthew's account of Jesus says that's what Jesus said was going to happen. Okay? I will just point out that as we look at these witnesses like Matthew and the other apostles, we're going to talk about them later as to whether they would lie about something like this. Okay, so just kind of, if you're thinking that, well, how can we trust Matthew because he's recording? If we don't actually have, Jesus didn't write a letter himself, just hold that thought until we get later on, probably the next class. All right, our next quote here is from John chapter 2, verses 19 through 22. Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple. Will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. So Jesus tells the Jews that if they destroy this temple, he's going to raise it up in 3 days. They understand it to be talking about Herod's temple, and so they said it's taken 46 years to build it, you're going to rebuild it in 3 days. What a lot of nonsense. The disciples don't understand what Jesus is saying, and John says so. John says we didn't understand it, but when he was raised from the dead, we remembered that he had made that statement, and we believed. Okay? He does say it in the third person, but John is one of those who believed. Okay? So John is writing much later. Matthew's gospel, where would we peg that time-wise? Probably the 50s A.D., okay? So very early. John's gospel? 90s, okay? Early to mid-90s A.D., so much later. And this is what John writes about that. All right, let's look at another quote here. This is from Romans chapter 10 and verse 9. So it is from the hand of Paul, the pen of Paul. Paul says, "Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved." All right, let's just consider Paul for just a moment. He's writing these words to the Romans, and he says that in order to be saved, you have to do what?
Confess with your mouth.
You have to confess that Jesus is Lord, and you have to believe that God did what?
Raised him from the dead.
Raised him from the dead. Okay? So people today who claim to be Christians, who do not believe in the resurrection, need to go back and reread what Paul wrote here to the saints in Rome. He says you've got to confess that Jesus is Lord. You've got to believe that he was raised from the dead. All right. So question. Again, looking at Paul, he writes these words. What's his basis for knowledge? He's not there on the first Sunday following the crucifixion. He's not there when Peter and John go to the tomb and Jesus isn't there. He's not on the road to Emmaus when Jesus appears. He's not up in the upper room when Jesus appears, not once, but a week later, twice. He's not with the disciples on the Sea of Galilee when Jesus grills and eats fish. So what's his basis for saying that he believes in the resurrection?
Jesus appeared for sure.
Good. Jesus appeared to him. Where?
On the road to Damascus.
On the road to Damascus. Okay? Paul gets a special appearance from Jesus on the road to Damascus. So, he can pen these words very easily to the saints in Rome because he had seen the risen Christ. And he's telling them, you have to believe that he was raised from the dead in order to be saved. Okay? That's Romans 10:9. Let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 and 4. Again, the pen of Paul. And he says, "For I delivered to you As of first importance, what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that He was buried, that He was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. So what is of first importance in the gospel? There are three things there. What are they? Tom, give me one.
Sorry, I was typing notes.
I'm sorry. So I'll pick on someone else. Anna, can you give me the first thing that is of first importance?
That Christ died.
Okay, that Christ died for our sins. All right, we'll just add that phrase to that. What is the second item that is of first importance? Linda?
He was buried.
That He was buried. And what is the third item that is of first importance? That He was raised from the dead on the third day. Okay? By the way, that He was buried there is important. Most people who were crucified were not buried. It's actually fairly unusual. As a matter of fact, it's so unusual that in the archaeological record we have direct evidence of crucifixion, and there are 3 cases at the most. Up until recently, the only archaeological evidence of crucifixion was from outside the walls of Jerusalem from the 1st century. Okay? But they found a guy in England who had been crucified. The evidence of this is in the bones. Specifically, in the area around Jerusalem, the evidence is because the nail is still stuck through his heels. Most of the time, when someone was crucified, their body was thrown out for the animals to eat. There was no dignity and no honor, even in death. Okay? So, Paul says what? He was buried. If He had not been buried, if He had been treated like most other people who were crucified, it would be really hard to have a resurrection, right?
Yes. Well,
Not that it would be hard for God to resurrect, but it would be hard to have the evidence of it. Okay? It would be hard to have the evidence of it. So those are the things. He died, He was buried, and He was raised. By the way, that's a picture of what?
The gospel.
It's a picture of the gospel. Good. It's a picture of baptism. This is reenacted. Every single time someone is baptized, they reenact this. They die, they're buried, and they're raised. First importance. Charlotte?
The first importance, what is that exactly referring to?
The fundamental, absolute, important facts of the faith.
Okay. The first. Is that what you said? Okay.
The absolute, fundamental facts of the faith. Okay, first importance. That's like, who is of first importance in your life? Okay, beyond God, who's from an earthly standpoint, who's of first importance? Bob. Okay, all right, we understand that. First importance. Okay, so that's what he's talking about. Okay, so next quote is also from 1 Corinthians, this time chapter 15, verses 14 through 19. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain. We are even found to be misrepresenting God, because we testified about God that He raised Christ, whom He did not raise, if it is true that the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, and you are still in your sins. And those also who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. If in Christ we have hope in this life only, we are of all people most to be pitied. So if Christ is not raised,
This is all for naught.
it's all for nothing. That's exactly right. Why are you here? Why are we here? Why are we doing this? Because we just like each other? We didn't know each other for the most part before we became Christians. We're here because Christ was raised from the dead. If He wasn't raised, guys, we should all be going home and doing whatever we want to do. We should eat, drink, and be merry. For tomorrow we die. Okay? But if Christ is raised, then what we are doing here is of vital importance. All right, so from a scriptural standpoint in the New Testament, absolutely no question at all that Jesus predicted and early Christians believed in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So, I would present to you 4 historical facts. Not theories, not ideas, not I think so's. These are 4 historical facts. Fact number 1. A man named Jesus lived in Palestine during the 1st century AD. How do we know that? Historically. We have the testimony of his disciples, we have the testimony of early Christians, and we have the testimony of people who were not Christians. Okay? If the only testimony we had was from 12 guys, that fact might be questionable. But because we have it from 3 different sources, broad groups of sources, from a historical standpoint, that's a fact, regardless of what National Geographic or Newsweek or anyone else might have us believe. Historical fact number 2. He was executed, this man named Jesus, was executed in Judea when Pontius Pilate was Roman governor. How do we know that? Again, from the testimony of those who knew him, but who else? Testimony of people who were not Christians, and in fact were even antagonistic towards Christians. They record that he was killed while Pilate was Roman governor. That makes that a historical fact. Okay? Fact number 3. He was buried, and on the 3rd day his tomb was found empty. That is a historical fact. Notice I did not write he was buried, and on the 3rd day he was raised. Why did I not say that's a fact?
You can't prove it historically.
Oh, lots of answers, didn't understand any of them. Tom, you start,
Can't
Linda,
be
you
proved
finish.
historically.
Cannot be proved historically. Linda, would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, nobody saw it. I mean,
Okay.
they just saw
No
it.
one saw the resurrection. We have the testimony of some who claimed he was resurrected. Okay? We don't have the same level of testimony we would have to the other facts. But it is a historical fact that his tomb was found empty on the 3rd day. No one has disputed that. The Jews did not, on the day of Pentecost, say, "You silly people. You just got to the wrong grave. Jesus wasn't in that grave. He was in this grave. And here he is. Let's bring the body out." They didn't do that. They didn't know where the body went either. They didn't believe in a resurrection, but they knew his body was missing. Okay? So it is a historical fact that his tomb was found empty. 4th historical fact is that about 50 days after his death, his disciples began to preach his resurrection. That is historical fact as well. Okay? Whether it's true or not remains to be seen. But that it was a historical fact is beyond doubt. When?
Beyond doubt, beyond the writings in the Bible.
Yes, we saw some of those earlier. They claimed that he was raised. That said that Christians claimed he was raised.
Okay.
And we've got a lot of sources about that.
Okay.
So those are 4 historical facts. Notice that the resurrection is not a historical fact. Does that bother you that I say that? I hope not. It's not a historical fact. Do I believe in the resurrection? Absolutely. Based on evidence. Okay. But as facts go, that isn't one. The fact that we have is that his tomb was found empty. The fact that the disciples began to preach about the resurrection, we have. But whether he was actually raised or not is what we then got to investigate further. So testimony is important. And we have testimony, don't we, about Jesus being raised? Who do we have? Quite a few. Okay, Paul saw him. Peter saw him. John saw him. As a matter of fact, all the 11 apostles saw him, didn't they? And others. Who's the first person to see Jesus? Not Peter. Not John.
Mary.
Which Mary?
Baxley.
Mary Magdalene is the first person to see Jesus. Okay? I would just say this. If anybody tries to tell you that the Bible is a misogynist book, remember who Jesus appeared to first. A woman who in contemporary Jewish society, her word really didn't mean a whole lot. And that's who Jesus appears to first. Okay? That's not an accident, guys. It's not an accident. If first century Jewish men were making up the writings of the New Testament, I guarantee you Mary Magdalene would not have been the first person to see Jesus. It would have been Peter or John or some other man. Okay? That's evidence as well for where the Bible comes from. Man would not have written the story that way. Okay? Jewish men of the first century would not have written the story that way. But they did because they recorded it accurately. Todd?
Kind of back on the previous point about no witnesses to his resurrection. Wouldn't the 500 that were raised after his resurrection be considered witnesses?
You know, that's very interesting because well, it's not 500. It's 500 that he appears to later. Okay?
Yeah.
You're talking about all the ones who were raised in the city of Jerusalem. Interestingly, nothing else is ever said about them. How long did they get to stick around? What happened to them then later? Did they live the rest of their lives and then die? It's indicated and it's dropped. And they would not have been witnesses to Jesus' resurrection. Right. What we do have, and that's my second point here, is we do have testimony of people who saw the risen Jesus. Okay? And so we take that testimony in tandem with the fact of the empty tomb. So you go back to those historical facts. It's a historical fact the tomb is empty. Are there different possible explanations for an empty tomb? There are. We're going to look at some of them in this class. If you looked ahead in the papers, you already know that. How many of y'all cheated and looked ahead in the papers? Raise your hand. Admit it. Don't be afraid. Okay, Sherry did. Okay. We're going to talk about that later. Okay, there can be different explanations. But the explanation of a whole lot of people was Jesus was dead, and then we saw him. And he did all sorts of kind of interesting things, like come through doors that are locked. Right? The upper room. Did all sorts of kind of things, like spent some time on the road with two disciples going to Emmaus. And he hid his identity from them in a miraculous way. So they didn't recognize him until later, when he left them. Did all sorts of kind of interesting things, like eating fish. Right? How many of y'all have ever seen Pirates of the Caribbean? The first one. Okay. I love, there's a scene in Pirates of the Caribbean where in the moonlight it reveals their true selves. And their true selves they are skeletons. Okay? And so you see these guys taking bites of apples and eating food, and it just drops out because they don't have a stomach. Okay? And the statement is made, it just turns to ash in our mouths. We don't get to taste it. Okay? Jesus, when he appears to the disciples, eats fish. And he's not a ghost from the Pirate of the Caribbean. Okay? He does things that a resurrected person can do. And we have witnesses of that. So we take their testimony in tandem with the fact of the empty tomb. The fact of the empty tomb must be accounted for. And these witnesses provide one possible, but not the only possible explanation. It's just like, I gotta pick on somebody else, Tom. I can keep accusing you of murder. Let's be equal opportunity in this, ladies. Mimi. She looks like a dangerous kind of book. Mimi's on trial for murder. The prosecutor is going to present a narrative, hopefully in his mind, demonstrating that Mimi was in fact the one who was guilty. Stephen will have mortgaged everything he has to get the absolute best defense attorney. Oh, yes, you will, Steve. Don't do that. No. Not if you don't want to sleep in the doghouse tonight. To get the best possible attorney. And that best possible attorney is going to do everything to provide an alternate narrative. They're going to try to convince the jury that that narrative is correct and the prosecutor's is false. This is the way trials work. Okay? And so we have an empty tomb. Has to be accounted for. Where did the body go? One possible explanation is what these Christians give us. There are other possible explanations. Looking at historical, legal, logical evidence, we ask ourselves two questions. What are they? What is possible and what is reasonable? We're going to rule out right now the explanation that aliens came down and stole Jesus' body. Why are we going to rule that out?
You have no evidence.
Because it's not possible. Doesn't have to be reasonable or not. It's not possible. Why? Because there is no proof of aliens. Okay? It would be like if you tried to say it wasn't aliens, it was a boat of Mayans that crossed the Atlantic Ocean and popped in Jerusalem and stole Jesus' body. No, not possible. Okay? Beyond the fact that it's so unreasonable, it's not even worth even dignifying with a response. Okay? But we look at things because the ones we will look at tonight are possible. We have to ask ourselves whether they're reasonable. Okay? Alright, so we have to account for the empty tomb. Okay, so here we go. Here's our reference, Todd, that you're asking about. 1 Corinthians 15, 5-8. Testimony of witnesses. That he appeared to Cephas. Who's Cephas? Peter. Then to the 12. Who are the 12?
The apostles.
The apostles. Okay. Technically speaking, how many of them were there at this point in time? 11. But they're still called the 12. Okay. Just like we have the 12 tribes of Israel, even though they were technically how many? 13. Okay. Then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time. There's your reference, Todd. Most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. So the majority of these 500 witnesses were still alive when Paul writes the letter to the Corinthians. Corinthians, early 60s, late 50s, mid to late 50s AD. Okay? So relatively early. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. Now, if you try to put these appearances that Paul mentions with what we read about in the gospel accounts, you're going to come up a little bit short. Okay? Because there's some things that are not mentioned. This appearance to James, apparently by himself, kind of hard to figure out where to put that. What about the appearance to Cephas? Where is that? Give you a hint. I think he was traveling to Emmaus with someone else. They're not mentioned by name in that narrative, but the indications are elsewhere that that in fact was Peter. Okay? So if you take it in the order that they're giving it to us, it's hard to put all of that together. So for example, the more than 500 brothers at one time, when was that? Anybody give me book, chapter, and verse out of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John? I can't either. But Paul mentions it here. Okay? We remember the Gospels don't record every detail. So there are things that are not recorded in the Gospels that Paul catches here in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. So lots of witnesses. By the way, who's not mentioned in there?
Mary Magdalene.
Mary Magdalene. Okay? She's not mentioned at all in this particular text. And yet she is the first person to see the risen Jesus. Alright, so that's our testimony. 1 Corinthians 15, 5-8 is not an exhaustive list. So, for example, we have other witnesses. We have Mary Magdalene. She's mentioned in Mark 16:9, John 20 and verse 16. We have the other Mary, Matthew chapter 28, verse 1, also verses 9 to 10. We have Cleopas and an unnamed disciple, Luke chapter 24, 1 through following. Who is that unnamed disciple according to my theory?
Well, you say Peter.
I say Peter. I say Peter. Okay, I'll let y'all dwell on that a little bit. Okay, I do say Peter. That Peter is the unnamed disciple here that is mentioned. Cleopas, who in the world is this guy?
Someone they knew.
Who was on the road to Emmaus. Very good. All right, that's like the other Mary. Who exactly is that? the other Mary. Okay? Sometimes we just get these references. They knew who they were. We don't necessarily know who they all were. Mary Magdalene's there, and these other folks. In addition to the ones that Paul mentions. These are not mentioned in the text. All right, so explanations for the empty tomb. This is a very good stopping spot. As a matter of fact, it's an excellent stopping spot. So this is where we are going to